Hello and welcome to JLM University. My name is Paul and today I'm going to show you how to change out a pivot bracket side plate on a PowerPole Move PV. Please check the description below for a list of recommended tools. Before doing any work on your PowerPole Move PV, be sure to turn off the power and beware of pinch points. Now we're going to use our Phillips screwdriver to remove the two Phillips pan head screws on either side of the upper shroud assembly along with lock washers. Now that the screws have been removed, we're going to simply raise the upper shroud assembly. Now that the upper shroud assembly has been raised, we're going to take a Phillips screwdriver and we're going to remove the two screws along with lock washers from the cover of the steering circuit board. Now to remove the cover, just take your two fingers and simply just pull out and straight up on it. Okay, now we're going to use a flat-headed screwdriver to place in the slot on the upper shroud pin. And while holding that in position, we're going to use our ratchet with our 3/16 attachment to break it free. Once loose, you want to simply remove the screw along with the washer. Okay, now we want to repeat the same process on the opposite side. Once the last screw is removed, you can remove the upper shroud assembly. Now we're going to stow the PowerPole Move PV to remove the nav head. Now we're going to use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the 7 brass screws underneath the navigation head. Now that the brass screws have been removed, we're going to remove the navigation head by simply pulling straight out on it and disconnecting the white power lead connector. Now we're going to remove the last 4 brass screws that hold the coil mold over retainer on. Okay, now that the 4 brass screws have been removed, we're going to remove the coil cable mold over retainer. Now we're going to remove the coil cable from the base of the nav head by simply pulling straight out on it. Now use a 9/64" Allen key with ratchet to remove the cap screws underneath the bottom of the navigation head. Now we're going to use our flat-headed screwdriver to pry the clamp from the shaft. Now remove the navigation head base. Now it's time to remove the shaft from the unit, and we're going to do this by slightly deploying it and then disengaging the shaft clamp. Now we're going to slide the clamp a few inches up the shaft. At this time we're going to deploy the unit by pushing on the foot pedal and also supporting the motor until it disengages from the propulsion motor cradle. Now it's time to remove the shaft from the unit. You'll do this by disengaging the shaft clamp and pulling the shaft out of the steering motor. While supporting the propulsion motor and pulling the shaft out, make sure you have clearance. Now for the next step of the process, we are going to need to redeploy the unit. Now we're going to be removing the pivot arm brackets, port and starboard, along with the crossbar assembly, along with compliance rings with a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips screwdriver. Let's start by removing the 2 screws from the crossbar. Now let's remove the crossbar assembly. Now we're going to remove the springs from the pivot arms by pulling up and over the pins. Now we're going to be removing our 3/8 E-clip with a flat-headed screwdriver. Now that we've taken the E-clips off, we're going to remove the pins. Now that the pins have been removed, we're going to rotate the bracket forward. Now that the foot pedal bracket has been removed, the pivot arm can come off very easily. Now by hand, remove both water shield clips and lift the water shield out. Now we're going to use our Phillips screwdriver to remove the 2 Phillips screws in either the power cord or the coil cable, depending on what side you are replacing. Now we're going to remove the wire lead from the baseboard and then pull it through the lower shroud. Next, we will remove the 3 screws from the lower shroud. Now remove your lower shroud. Now using your 7/8" wrench, we're going to break free both hex nuts on both sides of the steering motor. Now it's time to remove our pivot bracket plate. We're going to need to remove the 3 shoulder screws at the bottom of the plate. We'll do this with a 3/16 Allen and ratchet. Now that the shoulder screws have been removed, you want to support the motor and remove the plate and lock bar at the same time. And now it's time to install the pivot bracket plate and the lock bar to the base. With the pivot bracket in place, we're going to install our 3 shoulder screws. Before installing, you want to add 1 drop of blue Loctite to the threads. Be sure to use your torque wrench and tighten to the specific torque specifications found in your instructions provided. Now it's time to install our lower shroud into position. Next, we will reinstall our screws with lock washers and then apply dielectric grease. And now it's time to reinstall the wire lead through the hole in the lower shroud and onto the baseboard. Next, we need to fasten the wire lead to the baseboard with the 2 screws and then add dielectric grease. Next, we need to add dielectric grease to the cavities on the back of the water shield and then place it onto the baseboard. With the water shield in position, we need to install our water shield clips. Before installing the pivot bracket arm, be sure that the pin for the spring is facing in. Before you secure your pivot arms, you want to install your crossbar assembly in between the 2 arms. Make sure your compliance rings are on the bar. Next, secure your crossbar with the 2 screws and be sure to use Loctite. Next, we need to attach our spring to the upper pivot arm and to the lower pivot bracket plate. Now we will flip the foot release arms back to align. While holding the arm in position, insert your pin. Next, we want to install our E-clips onto the pin with our E-clip tool. Now we are ready to install our shaft, but first we need to put the unit in the stowed position. Push down on the foot release pedal and then pull up on the cradle until it locks into position. Align the shaft and run it through the bottom of the steering housing. And now that the shaft has been installed about halfway, you want to install your shaft clamp. Be sure that the P is facing up. Now we will secure the propulsion motor into the cradle. Next, we need to slide on the navigation head base onto the shaft and install our clamp. And now align this tab on the clamp up with a keyhole in the shaft. Now we're going to replace our nylon lock nuts into the holes with a nylon of the nut facing outward on both sides. And now we're going to install our cap screws onto each side. And be sure to torque each one of these. Now that the navigation head base is torqued into position, we're going to install our coil cable. Before inserting the coil cable, be sure that the vent tube aligns the groove in the coil cable. Now we want to feed the white connector through the mold-over retainer. Now that the mold-over retainer is into position, we want to install our 4 brass screws. It's now time to install your navigation head. Be sure you plug your white connector in and you should hear a click. Now place the white connector into its holder. Now it's time to finish installing the navigation head. We'll do this by tucking the wires into the groove of the connector holder. It's important that these wires are routed correctly so they do not get pinched. Now insert your 7 brass screws. Now it's time to deploy the PowerPole Move PV. It's now time to install the rear cover. Now it is time to install the upper shroud. First, we're going to install our washers on the very inside of the upper shroud. Now that the washers are in position, we're going to place it in line with the upper pin. Next, we're going to place the sides of the upper shrouds in position. Now we need to place our washer onto the screw and install it into the upper pin of the upper shroud. And add 1 drop of blue Loctite to the end of the threads. And the last thing we need to do is install the 2 screws on either side of the upper shroud. And that is how you change out a pivot bracket side plate on a PowerPole Move PV. Thank you for watching.